Welcome to the Productivity Podcast. This is the final episode in our series of 3 with our friends at Rotageek, and back again for the third and final episode is David Bain. Hi, David.
Hi, Simon.
We're getting good at this. We're on the third one now. We've looked at automating scheduling. We've talked about some of the benefits. We've talked about will you ever be able to press the button and it goes on the wall and everybody works to it, which I think was a really interesting debate. And we'll see if either of us was close in probably the next 5 to 10 years. On this episode, we're going to touch on kind of where do you start? So what's the typical journey you would take a new customer on, and the things that you'd talk to them about, maybe some of the sessions you'd have, and then some of the things you'd work through with them. And then we're going to kind of contextualize that with you giving some real life examples from a proof of concept stroke rollout that you guys are currently working on. We're not going to name names, which is fair enough, but hopefully that kind of brings it to life for the listeners. Is that okay?
Yeah, sounds great.
Awesome. Okay, so treat me as Mr. Retailer X then. I've gone through all the process of looking around the market, etc., decided I really like what you guys do and the way you do it and the team you've got. Where do we start, and what kind of things, what journey do you take me on to get something up and running potentially?
Yeah, so I guess there's sort of two or three bits that we have to put in place. Maybe I'll just talk about that sort of almost this sort of discovery and planning element, and then talk about some of the kind of the operational implementation. But firstly, I guess Rotageek needs to know that when the devil is in the detail, I suppose, as it often can be with workforce, in the contracts and the practices, in the nature of the pattern of trade and the customers and everything. So we have to sort of, I guess, ensure that we've captured that sort of level of operational detail to make sure that we can do everything you've assumed we can do, and cover all of the functional bases that you need. And obviously we need to configure our system, which is quite configurable. So there's lots of little options you're going to have on and off. So we would go through a sort of discovery process to with I guess sort of the stakeholders, the people who are trying to achieve something from implementing digital scheduling. So be that sort of retail ops or HR or finance or wherever the kind of the drive is coming from, to understand kind of how things need to be different from today. And then we would spend a bunch of time with operational people understanding what it is about the process and the functional need, and how that's done manually or whatever today, to make sure we don't throw anything out that needs to be retained. So we'd sort of make sure we understand the process today, all the checks and balances, and the way calculations are done and all this kind of stuff in the business, to make sure that our tool at least has a way of doing those same things where they're needed, and bringing that sort of new angle where that's the objective of the project, is to do something differently. So we go through that discovery process, I guess, for the customer's benefit and for our own to be ready. We obviously need to sort of plan the change, and in the previous 2 episodes we've talked quite a lot, I think, about how, whilst it should be a win-win for employees and for the business, for customers, to start doing some of these things, get things on cloud, make them visible, get them mobile so employees are engaged, start automating so that the computer is solving these tricky jigsaws that managers find difficult, and there's a bit of room to do better. So we want to go through all that change, and it is win-win for those two sort of constituents if you do it right. But it is change. People's roles and their engagement with each other will slightly change. The shifts that you're asking your staff to work are probably going to change, and you've got a new piece of IT in your ecosystem. So there's a number of things that need sort of change management planning, and we obviously work very closely with a customer kind of implementation team to think about how's that going to be communicated, who needs to be trained on what, how's it going to be messaged, and ultimately how's it going to work, and how do we want to phase it, and all these sorts of different things. So we do all that change management kind of planning. And I guess finally, I sort of mentioned, it's a new piece of IT in your infrastructure, and of course, the more you're trying to do around data-driven scheduling and optimization and automation, the more things potentially we're going to want to be plugged into. So they're very likely we'll want to be plugged into HR and payroll anyway, because that's the kind of the sort of workforce management chain that scheduling sits in. Often quite a key win from implementing solution like ours is that it sits, there's a sort of digital gap in between, sort of onboarding your employees and knowing what their contract hours and so on are, and then sort of paying them at the end of each week or month. And there's a sort of, that's often involves some typing in or some lack of visibility in the interim and that kind of thing. And the scheduling system sitting as a link in that digital chain in the middle is really valuable. So we're obviously expecting to do that, but that needs planning, those integrations. either off the shelf or something more custom, but it needs to be implemented. But the more you're trying to do on the automation side, the more sources of data and inputs, budgets and historic trends and things like that we're going to want to be able to consume. So there's often a bit of work to be done on the IT side just to kind of make sure that we're plumbed in to all those things so that we're getting the right data to drive it.
And do you find that organizations have that data on tap, or it's data that they have to go away and bring together from other sources in a way that you can use it? How up to date or how mature are lots of these retail organizations?
Well, I guess there's sort of different bits to it, but I guess we typically, let's say, just to be able to drive the absolute core of the forecasts of demand, we need to be able to access something that's at a kind of intraday granularity. We sort of typically say 15 minutes kind of granularity. And we want to be able to look at months or years of history for every store, really, of the data of kind of how busy the till has been. We only need one source. I mean, you can make it richer, but you can get off the mark with one source of data. And I guess most businesses do have that, right? A sort of sufficiently modern POS system that, transactions with timestamps going back a few years do exist. So actually, typically that data is quite accessible. If you want to be more sophisticated, and obviously there is sort of incremental returns from sort of being cleverer and cleverer about what are people buying, or tasks that are not to do with literally transacting with customers, but other things you might need to do for them from a service level perspective and that sort of thing. For those sorts of things, you're obviously looking for more and more data. Amazing if you can get either through cameras or Wi-Fi pings or whatever, if you can start to monitor the movement of customers around a store and you've got that kind of richness of data, obviously that's very exciting. But something around just the level of busyness in the store, usually from POS, is something that I guess most retailers find that they can access.
Yeah, and there's more and more move towards kind of internal data warehouses. I assume it becomes easier then to just plug in and start to pull out the bits that you need.
Right, exactly. And I think, we, as a sort of modern sort of tech platform, we're very excited about API integration. I guess typically we don't find that customer systems are quite ready for that in lots of cases. But that's not a limitation, at least from our point of view. Flat file transfers also work. So yes, the fact that the data exists in a warehouse and can be sent, even if that's just in a flat file, as I say, kind of is usually sufficient to at least make a start on attacking some of these benefits.
So you've worked with me to get an understanding of my business and to make sure there's no greyness in what we think the solution can do for us and what's going to be deployed. You've done some config, you've gathered some data. So what's next?
At some point in this process, although it might be the other side of some of the things we just talked about, I guess it's usually important to a customer to kind of size the prize. So we would do I guess the kind of offline analysis, effectively a dry run of what it will be like when you're optimizing your schedules using our platform. And that gives us a good opportunity to test some of the assumptions that we're making around constraints in schedules, which is really an HR policy type question. Are we producing rotas that your employees would be happy to work given their contractual and expectation kind of requirements of where they work, but it also enables us to compare that to current rotas, manual rotas that managers were making in a sample of stores for a few weeks before Rotageek, and we're able to compare those. So with our model of or even some actual data either way, but some data around how busy actually is a store in terms of that intraday shape. And then what was the rota what's the rota that you're working today? And then what's the optimized version subject to the constraints that you apply that Rotageek will come up with? And we look for the difference between those two, see which is kind of closer effectively and by how much. And we actually see reasonably consistent results there, as in the prize is usually plenty large enough to justify the sort of the change. It obviously, the size of the prize varies based on a few things, including, and we mentioned them earlier in this productivity series, but kind of if you've got quite volatile demand, very busy periods in your store and some quite quiet periods, and of course your challenge is to build a rota which does actually put staff levels up and down through the day like that, then we're typically looking at bigger wins. If you've got very small shop teams or very little flexibility or very flat demand, then that benefit would be smaller, but it's useful to quantify it. Of course, I guess when we deploy live, there's another way of measuring the the benefit or the win from all these things, which is to actually look at pre and post conversion and other measures of, how service might have made a difference to actual revenue from customers and other measures of customer happiness. But before we deploy, obviously, we're not able to do that. We're looking for ways of kind of proxying and modeling that, which we would typically do, kind of offline POC.
No, that makes sense. So we've got to a good place. We know that it's worth doing in short terms. There's something in it for colleagues. There's an upside for the business from an ROI point of view. And then do you typically try it live in a few stores? Does it roll out to the estate in one go? How does that process work typically? And I know it'll be different by different types of retailers, but is there a typical trend that you see?
Yes, I mean, I guess the steps for us would typically be what we've taken to calling conference room pilot to begin with. So before we are affecting frontline employees in the shifts they'll actually work next week, we want to get real managers looking at real days in their store as a sample, a small set of managers in a conference room, sort of particularly for the optimized scheduling, I guess, to be sort of running those schedules, checking. Again, it gives us proof points that there's nothing that's been missed. And it teaches us about the adoption as well. So we're learning a bit about, given what they're used to, how easy is this for managers to learn and how might it best be communicated? So that sort of CRP, and then, yes, phased trial or rollout. Obviously, I guess positioning it as a trial is kind of a commercial thing about whether the company sort of wants to have the option to not proceed with rollout and that kind of thing. I guess that's a commercial dimension of it. But whether you've got those kind of like break elements to our contract or not, yes, obviously, almost everybody we've ever done it with has wanted to do this as a quite phased rollout. Again, so that you're learning things from each step. So we would sort of typically onboard 10 stores in a single area, and then we'd onboard a second area faster, and then we would start rolling that out much to the rest of the estate beyond that. And because, I guess, some systems that you implement in a retail chain, only head office or specialist roles are really going to ever have very much to do with, and that's one kind of implementation, one kind of challenge. But obviously, this is a tool that everybody in the business, right down to 4 hours a week colleagues, are going to be using at least the Rotageek mobile app to sort of be told when they're being scheduled and to book their holiday and all those sorts of things. And every single store manager and deputy manager is probably going to be using the full sort of web platform to build and review and publish a rota and other kinds of communication to their store teams as well. So, there's a lot of people of varying degrees of techiness, enthusiasm for a digital project like this that have to be brought along, because you don't want any stores to kind of not adopt or to use it, to not be using it in the same way as everybody else. So from those phased rollouts, we're obviously partly learning about whether it's disruptive to the business, whether the prize is as big as we thought it was, and those sorts of things. But we're also learning a lot about that adoption curve and how best to get every single frontline employee to kind of to understand the new.
So you're kind of learning as you go and refining. So you've got that small control piece at the start when you're doing your conference room pilot, some refinement, and then maybe a smaller first bunch of stores that go live, refine, and then actually hit the wider estate at pace, because you kind of got a good repeatable model that works.
Exactly. And the more, and we've, sorry, not to go on in too much detail about it, but that business of sort of building your, not just learning, but building your champions early, leveraging the power of usually quite a sort of well-resourced L&D team in the business to bring that to those, potentially thousands of frontline colleagues, rather than sort of Rotageek doing it all ourselves or expecting every retailer to be the same as the last, but to really sort of, build those champions, leverage the L&D capability of the organization that's already there, and sort of adapt the messaging in that way. It is different every time, and it's really exciting. It's really fun.
Excellent. So let's put some context around that for people then. Let's talk about the case study of Retailer X. Before we jump into kind of solution and sizing of the prize and the prerequisites, what was their situation pre-Rotageek? How did they do scheduling and rotas?
So I'm going to sort of dive into an individual case here, as you say, without sort of mentioning any names. And the idea is really, I think it's something that's topical. It's a sort of pilot that's deploying now from Rotageek, and it's in a business that sort of it does have this quite it is quite a big prize in this case, because there's they do have this very very fungible store teams and very volatile demand, as in very busy times. So they're kind of quite good illustration of some of that opportunity. And I think a couple of things I'm going to mention now about their situation before Rotageek and everything else is quite, I think, illustrative of things we see quite often. And so maybe some of your listeners will sort of see themselves in some of these behaviors. But yeah, their situation pre-Rotageek, I guess, the goal of the project is very much to make rotors more efficient. So at the moment they have these quite fixed patterns, and they know that they want to change that. But they're I think quite intelligently thinking to themselves, I can see that there's inefficiency here, but how do I change it? What do I want to change them to? Do I have a model of what that looks like? Where would I get one? And if I was going to try and do this in a non-digital, sort of unenhanced kind of way, do I have the capability in my stores to do this? Like, where's the skill going to come from to start doing something new and better? And so that's, I guess, why they've decided to go with digital and optimizing tools. So it is about rotor efficiency. And maybe that's sort of obvious in a way, given the context of everything we're saying that Rotageek is about. But often getting digital and optimized scheduling in place is partly driven by other things, disintermediating older systems, getting that visibility and analytical data capture, or improving communication, through mobile and digital. There's lots of reasons actually sort of retailers embark on this process, but this very much has efficiency at the heart. And the current system that I guess supports these very fixed patterns is an in-house system. And so they're, I guess, almost chicken and egg, I suppose, of because people are used to working quite fixed rotors, there isn't the habit there, and the tool hasn't been sort of optimized around people checking it all the time and having very sort of live communication about rotors or requesting things and that kind of thing. So it's an in-house system that probably there is a bit of an IT agenda to move on from at some point, but also it's a bit limited in the way that you can communicate around it, and that is obviously based in the fact that they're used to working these fixed patterns. So there's a mutual dependency there to move away from it.
Interesting start point then. So you guys come along and start with some of the work you've described in the previous part of this in terms of the journey. Let's touch on the kind of sizing of the prize piece. How did that work?
Yeah, so I guess having gone through some of the steps that we mentioned earlier, where we make sure we understand what the kind of the policies and constraints are, so that the rotors, so that we are testing a real possibility for some of the new rotors that we're going to produce with auto scheduling. And obviously we had to access some data as well, even in a sort of trial kind of context, to be able to do forecasting and have a model of demand. But we started with that offline POC just to learn a few things. And yeah, we found some, I guess, as I say, at the higher end maybe, but indicative kind of numbers in this case. Current rotors were 40% sort of inaccurate, in the sense of 40% of the hours were either over at a quiet time, under at a busy time, so in the wrong place, which I guess sounds like quite a big number, but not wildly uncommon. And we found, I guess, by just letting the algorithm have a go at producing a rotor with the same staff, same building blocks as managers had, but with that more sort of granular and more conscious view of what demand really was, and trying millions of combinations to hit it, we were able to reduce that inaccuracy to 13%, so 27 percentage point gain. When we sort of think about we obviously then have a little look at where that's coming from, as in, is that to do with hours being assigned? When they're wrong, are they wrong in the sense of on the wrong time of day or the wrong day of the week, or are you assigning to the wrong task, or are we just assigning too many hours, given the sort of the time per task that I guess the finance team think people should be spending? And what we found, I guess, is that a pretty small component of that, 4%, a pretty small component of that was just over scheduling in total, which is good, because I guess if you find that most of the benefit is from over scheduling in total, but the only reason you think that is because of a kind of an input assumption that people should be spending less time on tasks, I guess it's hard to be confident that that's true, and that reducing in that way isn't just going to result in worse customer service. So that was quite a small component. About a third of it was from hours being scheduled into the wrong tasks, which I guess is to do with just slow evolution towards the way the business has evolved over the last 5 years, over assigning hours to merchandising and till, restocking, and under assigning hours to online picking, which obviously has grown quite a lot. For this, it's a grocery type retailer. Maybe I should have said to begin with. So they're doing picking in store for some delivered orders. Yeah. So there's a sort of there's a misassignment of hours there, probably just lagging the evolution of the business mix. And then of that remainder of kind of in-store hours, sort of half, I guess, from assigning hours to the wrong days and to the wrong times of day. And when we looked at the sort of times of day, we would see that manual rotors were typically kind of they were staffing the store as if the peak of demand was around 3 p.m. This is in the average store. I guess we looked across a few stores, but this is kind of average data. Typically, managers were looking at assuming that the peak of demand was around 3 p.m. with quite a long and flat peak throughout the afternoon, 12 till 5. But when we looked at the historic data for when the store was kind of, let's say, actually busy, we saw quite a sort of distinct peak around 1:30 p.m. Sort of a peak that was waning by 1:30 p.m. but a true peak between 12 and 1:30. So, I mean, don't know if those details sort of are interesting to people because they're obviously specific to this case, but I did think they were quite not uncommon for managers to model a sort of flatter peak of trade and later than it really is. Quite a common observation, and our model was obviously able to pick that up and think about it differently for each day of the week and each week of the year in each store. But those were sort of trends that we saw. So there was quite a big opportunity in a number of different areas, I guess, from that.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it, that some of the stats around the 40% of misaligned schedules and then that thing about the peak being flatter and longer, those are all bits that a typical store manager wouldn't know. You may have the intuition or you may have a gut feel about it, but the data proving it becomes really powerful and is fact. So you can't argue fact. It may feel differently, but that's the fact of the data that is going through the tills, the customer's experience, and all those things. So to flush that out at an early point must give some real confidence then to the next parts of the process.
Yes, and I think in various ways, it helps us and management sense check some of the outcomes, because obviously you can just say, oh, it's a very complicated model. We've done forecasting, it's down to the 15-minute level. Here are some numbers, but it's very nice to be able to say there are actually these trends, and you can see so for example, modeling or scheduling to a quite long flat peak throughout the afternoon, might be a misperception by managers, or it might be that it's just quite difficult to build a rota which sort of, the staffing level moves around enough to really get up to that peak at the real peak. It's just a difficult, as I say, we keep saying, jigsaw, quite a difficult jigsaw to do to get that result. And in the time they had to allocate to the task, they just sort of didn't achieve that, as opposed to not knowing that the demand is a bit peakier, but just being unable to do anything about it. And we see certain repeated biases in the way human beings left to their own devices build rotas or think about demand. And one of them is they'll absolutely overweight fixed tasks and underweight customer-facing time. And it's a really, really common kind of observable behavior in the way managers think about their stores and therefore that they express themselves in their rotas. So that stuff's really interesting, and it really helps us communicate what we're doing and the value that we're adding, but also obviously sense check anything that we end up doing differently.
So you talked around task there. So people's perception of over-indexing resource on task and under-indexing on maybe customer-driven stuff or more reactive stuff. Were you able to prove that through forecasting demand data in terms of the accuracy and those challenges that you've seen come out?
Yes, I mean, I guess in the case in point that I'm talking about here, I guess we don't yet have the proper before and after data. I mean, that's obviously going to be the real proof of the pudding, is to be able to show that we did actually, convert more customer baskets or make customers happier through the way that we're staffing the store now. And obviously, we don't have that data in this case yet, but we've seen that elsewhere for sure. That taking hours away from task and putting them more into customer-facing activities results in the way that you think that it would and hope that it would. You do sell more.
Good. So this customer's in a good place then. There's clearly lots of opportunity. We've done the sizing of the prize piece and kind of got to the bottom or surfaced some of the issues in terms of opportunity. Where are you now and what kind of things are you working with them on?
So we're into, with this particular customer, we're into the pilot now. I guess there was alongside I guess, this sort of almost mathematical proof, particularly around the optimized scheduling. And as we've mentioned elsewhere in the series here, optimized scheduling is kind of, it's the biggest prize, but it's also the sort of the last building block after you've already sort of made the leap into, people using in-store devices, web devices to access Rotageek and make their rotas, and frontline colleagues using Rotageek to request all their leave, and integrating with the payroll system so that when you've finished a week's work in Rotageek, you can sign off that timesheet there and that data go directly. So there's quite, all those other things have to be in place, and those all have to be, I guess, configured correctly so that we're doing all those business processes in a way that's going to work with other systems and policies. But the other sort of massive prerequisite for all of this, I think, and I did allude to it at the beginning, but the customer has to be willing to go on this journey. It is a change to the way people work, and if you're not prepared to, for example, standardize policies where you find that different store managers are doing slightly different things, and that's unfair or difficult to maintain, or you've got some quite rigid working patterns today, contractually or otherwise. Are you prepared to sort of grasp the nettle of trying to change those? And do you have the sort of the project team and the communication plan and everything else in place to learn about this as you go, and to bring your teams with you? So there are all these quite important prerequisites that I guess we've been through with this particular customer, and we always have to go through, sort of making sure they're in it for the right reasons and are thinking about it in a sort of constructive way, and are as excited about it as we are. So I guess with this particular customer, we've done that part, and we're now into the pilot, having done this discovery work on the mathematical side again, as we say, to unpick how are we going to forecast this business, what data do you have, how are we going to sort of fit some shapes to some budgets so you spend the same amount of hours as you're used to spending, but to spend them a bit more wisely, or are we going to try and sort of effectively build your labor models bottom up from some time per task labor standard kind of numbers that the business believes is good and again consistent across store to be spending on these things. So sort of resolve all those issues so that we're building up our inputs correctly in that way. And now we're trying out those schedules on real store teams. And I guess we'll watch this space to see what the end result is in terms of all the things we've talked about, the easiness to train and adopt, and ultimately the results for customers and teams.
Amazing. Well, it sounds like you're on the footing of a successful project with a happy customer, hopefully. So fingers crossed. These projects, as we know historically, are difficult. Workforce management projects. I always kind of make a likeness to EPOS. So EPOS tills, for those that potentially don't know what EPOS is. So replacement till projects, you put that software in, colleagues turn up and they have to press the buttons in a certain order to accept a cash payment, a card payment. So it's very, very binary, and you know the end state before you start. I always think scheduling workforce management initiatives, there's a prize, there's a real opportunity, some really hard, tangible benefits and some really softer ones for colleagues and customers. But actually, you only see the output at the end, and almost some of the hard work starts then. So actually, that's when you really understand the gap or the shift in terms of colleague hours that need to move, or where you've got task in the wrong place, or presumptions about busy times and quiet times that the data just doesn't support. So for me, they're really, really interesting projects, hence why we're involved and we love them, and you guys do. But you travel in hope until you start to get the data in and see the output, whereas classic IT projects, you're really clear on what the output is before you start. So that's for me where the magic is towards the end of these implementations and projects, but also where lots of the softer hard work starts in terms of people management, coaching, moving shifts, recruiting differently. Does that ring true with you, David?
Oh, totally agree. And the other exciting piece, I guess, for me is that it feels like from a tools perspective, we're almost only just getting started. There's so much more. We talked about a few of these things that are on our sort of roadmap, and but to be able to accommodate not just statistical ways of thinking about how busy a store is, but also some of those more local knowledge or more subjective predictive elements. Auto scheduling a new week in the future where you don't yet have a rota, obviously is a key piece of this. But then all of those little choices you're going to make between now and that sort of day of trade actually happening in your store, about things you're going to approve, things that you want to change, the optimal ways of rejuggling, all this kind of stuff. There's quite a lot of things here that we've not yet done, and we're excited to keep building, because I think there's a lot more to go for.
Yeah, it's an interesting space to be in, and clearly lots of opportunity to drive through automation, like we talked about, AI, machine learning, adoption. So interesting times are ahead. And on that note, David, I think we'll draw a line under the series. It's been great to chat in the 3 episodes. We've covered some great ground on all 3. If people want to find out more about Rotageek and the things you do, or just a general chat about workforce management in general, where's the best place for them to reach out to?
Yeah, well, people would love people to sort of. I hope that people have found this interesting and would love to sort of talk to people who are thinking about this now. So yes, go to our website, rotageek.com. You'll find a fair amount of information there. Capturing some of the things I've been talking about here, and ways to get in touch with us, and our sort of account management team and others will come back to you, and we'll work out what we can do together.
Well, once again, I really appreciate your time. It's been a fantastic chat over the 3 episodes, and hopefully those that have listened have gained something for it in terms of new understanding, or we've reinforced some points that they already knew. So once again, thank you, David, and take care.
Thanks a lot for having me, Simon. Cheers.